Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's seventh and final episode in our summer series, you will hear presentations from our conference, Menzies and the British Commonwealth of Nations. The first presentation is by Dr. Paul Brown on Sons of Empire, Menzies, Downer and their response to Britain joining the EEC. The second presentation is by Andrew Kemp on A Very Different World, Robert Menzies, Harold Macmillan and the End of Greater Britain. The third presentation and final presentation in our summer series is by McLennan on Menzies and Diefenbaker, Navigating the Post-British World.
It's a story that illuminates not just Britain and Australia, but the wider transformation of the Anglo world, the world that formed them. To grasp this emotional and political significance of these events, we begin by the world created and which shaped Menzies and Downer, a world that historian James Curran has called the imaginative bridge between Australia and Britain, and what Neville Meaney described as the Britishness of Australian identity. For Menzies, British civilization was the intellectual foundation of his politics. His legal training taught him that the English common law represented the apex of political evolution. Westminster responsible government was a miracle of liberal restraint. The monarchy provided dignity, continuity, and legitimacy. He could recite, as we know, we heard before about walking around cricket quoting Shakespeare. He could quote vast sections of Tennyson, Shakespeare, Edward Arnold, and the Bible from memory. Not as affectation, but because these texts formed his imaginative world. He had imagined Scotland, or did he imagine England? That was the debate we've been going through the last 2 days. Again and again, Menzies described Britain as the home of my imagination, and he meant it literally. Britain was not foreign, it was the civilizational home whose traditions animated the Australian experiment in self-government. Now, for Alexander Downer, otherwise known as Alick Downer, the connection was even more familial. His grandfather, Sir John Downer, attended imperial conferences. He corresponded with British statesmen, and he saw that the Commonwealth was an extension of the Australian Constitution, and the imperial crown. His father, Sir Alick's namesake, grew up in a South Australia whose cultural architecture, schools, law courts, universities, clubs imitated British originals with pride. In the Downer household, Britain was spoken of with reverence. Alexander Downer later reflected that his father saw Britain as the centre of the civilised world, not in a chauvinistic sense, but in a deeply filial one, an extended family. We were family. The Liberal Party that Menzies built after 1944 was also steeped in British assumptions. Inherited freedoms, civic duty, gradual reform, of which talked about Burkean progressive reform, making reform sustained by the community, sustained by 9 elections over 18 years, not going ahead of the electorate, and being suspicious of continental ideologies. None of this was pretense. Both men truly believed that Australian civilisation was anchored in British civilisation. Not by force, not by sentiment, not by some romantic, nostalgic dream, but through the cultural affinity. Thus, when I describe them as sons of empire, I'm describing men who carry Britishness not as clothing, but as cultural DNA. In fact, the expression sons of empire comes from Alexander Downer, as opposed to Alick Downer, giving a valedictory speech in London when he concluded as Australian High Commissioner of England in, I think it's 2017, where he says, "My father was a son of empire." So I've extended that to describe both Menzies and Downer as sons of empire. But the 1960s would test this inheritance in ways neither fully anticipated. So when Downer arrived in London in 1964, Alick Downer arrived as High Commissioner. He believed he was stepping into the most important role of his life. Unlike many Australians who took diplomatic postings as semi-retirement, Downer approached it as the pinnacle of a lifetime service. He had been Immigration Minister. Menzies had appointed him in 1958. We're just talking, David and I, about the abolition of the dictation test in 1958. This was something that Alick Downer had initiated and was probably one of the early beginnings of the dismantling of the White Australia policy. They were friends. I've often thought that Menzies loved Downer as a friend. Often when he came to England, he would stay with Downer, either at Stoke Lodge or I think it's Wiltshire and Oaks. Oaks, there was a place that, it was a country estate for Alick Downer, and they would sit around the fire and talk about everything that occurred between them. I also think in a way that Alick Downer was never a threat to Menzies. I've reflected on this. Menzies often had people around him that he got on very well with, like a brother, but also there was nothing threatening about Alick Downer. He arrived expecting to find a Britain resembling the Britain of his upbringing, perhaps battered by war, diminished in wealth, but still the moral and strategic centre of the Commonwealth. Instead, he found a Britain in decline, a Britain in the midst of decolonisation, a Britain struggling with chronic economic weakness, a Britain whose politicians increasingly view the EEC as its economic future, and a Britain that no longer saw Australia as kin, or as some of Wilson's Labor colleagues called kith and kin, in any meaningful political sense. The British Foreign Office now spoke of the language of Europe, not empire. British cabinet papers from the era, particularly from Wilson and Heath government, who introduced England to the EEC in 1973, reveal a frank acknowledgement that the Commonwealth had little economic value. Trade with Australia was modest compared with the booming continental market. Now, where Downer expected affection, he found indifference. Where he expected continuity, he found rupture. It was the wrong posting at precisely the wrong time. Or, for historians of identity and emotion, perhaps exactly the right time, because Downer's reactions reveal much about the psychological dimensions of imperial retreat. And one of the richest aspects of this story is the personal friendship I've just outlined. After retiring from office in 1966, Menzies visited Britain repeatedly. On several occasions, he stayed with Downer at the places I've just mentioned. Menzies was paternal, reflective, sometimes melancholic. Downer was animated, incredulous, at times indignant. These conversations reveal, and if you look at the correspondence which I've studied, the letters between Downer and Menzies, is quite a lot of correspondence to read. You can see this relationship. And you can see in Menzies had already confronted the limits of British power during World War II. He understood that being on the Imperial War Cabinet, he understood the decline of empire as an historical process. He saw Britain's turn as regrettable but rational. And he accepted that sentiment could not override economics. Now, the contrast is that Alick Downer was described by Lord Carrington as an angry Anglophile, a violent Anglophile. In fact, Stuart Ward says in his book on Australian High Commissioners, he quotes Lord Carrington as a violent Anglophile. In other words, this idea that Menzies and Downer could be more British than the British. They believed so much in the British Empire that this was betrayal. Going to the EEC was betrayal. With respect, Georgina, your grandfather, unfortunately, had spent time in Changi in World War II, in prison. Can you imagine how he felt, giving his life to his country, to Britain? And he died a relatively young man, injured by what the service he'd given to his country. He felt aggrieved by what England was doing personally because he had contributed everything to the British Empire. This was personal. This is very personal. And these people are, in a sense, Downer and Menzies, representative of another time. It's the sunset of the British Empire for Australia. It went down very quickly, didn't it? Stuart Ward says it just disappeared, end of empire. It all went away for Australia, like within 5-8 years. So what were the events? The east of Suez, the Wilson's government decision to withdraw British forces east of Suez. Downer believed that Australia's security architecture was built on a tripod of the British Commonwealth, the monarchy, the shared strategic horizon of the English-speaking world. When Britain announced withdrawal, it seemed to topple that tripod. He actually warned London that withdrawal would damage the very foundations of Commonwealth defence cooperation. His tone was emotional because for him, the empire had not been a temporary scaffolding, It had been a civilizational structure. This is the point. It's not romantic nostalgia about Robbie Burns' Cotter's Saturday night that Menzies would love to tell the story around the hearth and reading of the Bible in Scotland. It's civilizational destruction for these men. It's the end of everything they'd believed in. The sterling devaluation is a second area. The sterling meant Britain's weakness laid bare. The 1967 devaluation of sterling struck Downer as another humiliation, a symbolic acknowledgement that Britain no longer possessed the economic strength to sustain global leadership. To Downer's mind, sterling was not merely a currency, it was a metaphor for British stability. Britain faced massive balance of payments problems, industrial stagnation, and competitive pressure from Europe and Japan. For Downer, whose worldview married economics to emotion, he interpreted devaluation as part of a continuum. First withdrawal from global defence, then a weakening currency, then immigration reforms. And that brings me to my third point. One of the most egregious areas for both Downer and Menzies was the changes to the collapse of Commonwealth hierarchies and immigration reform. No issue inflamed Downer more than the frustrations that this brought. Historically, Australians entering Britain were treated as subjects of the Crown, enjoying privileged access. But immigration laws in the 1960s increasingly treated Australians like any other Commonwealth citizens. And we had the new Commonwealth, the old Commonwealth, the new Commonwealth, no special category. For both the men, this was intolerable. Australians should be given preference. He told the British ministers that Australia and the other white dominions constituted a special category, what he called the Crown Commonwealth. That should remain distinct from newer republics that were emerging from decolonisation. I think, as Peter pointed out, was that there were more coloured members of the Commonwealth by this time than there were non-coloured. The fourth area, Britain and the EEC, the moment that everything changed. And then came the climatic issue, the Britain's bid to join the EEC. For both Downer and Menzies, this was apocalyptic. The EEC was not just a trading bloc, it was a symbolic area of Britain turning its back on Commonwealth preference, imperial history, strategic partnership, and shared identity, British race patriotism, we talked about before. Downer told British ministers that membership would sever emotional ties and redefine the British world in a way that excludes Australia, quoted. Historians now widely accept that Britain's entry into Europe fundamentally reoriented its global posture. But Downer's response, fierce, uncompromising, morally charged, alienated many at Whitehall. He insisted that Britain owed loyalty to the old dominions. He argued that Commonwealth ties were superior to continental integration. He accused British policy of betrayal. Now, back in Australia, both Downer and Menzies' response was seen as anachronistic. In Canberra, Holt embraced the United States and regional diplomacy. Gorton articulated an Australian nationalism less dependent on Britain. Macmillan lacked the stature to push back against British policy. Whitlam openly sought to end the cultural cringe and reorient Australia towards Asia. Now, I wanted to bring all this together in the final piece to interpret some of these events and to understand the traditional understanding on the background that we've looked at with Menzies. Was Downer an Anglophile holdout, and was Menzies a pragmatic realist? I'm challenging that view here today, saying that they had a shared worldview. It wasn't as if Downer was by himself. In a way, he was protecting Menzies. They had a British civic identity defining their political outlook. They both shared a sense of constitutional liberty and responsible government. And as I said before, it was not nostalgia, but an intellectual tradition. So the key to understanding this is the Kemp paradigm. I call this the Kemp paradigm. Dr. David Kemp had a big influence on my PhD, challenging me through an examiner to reinterpret my events through the lens of political credo. Inherited beliefs. What are the inherited beliefs that shape politicians? What are the sets of values, the Weltanschauung? What is the assumptions felt as facts, as David Needham would call them, assumptions felt as facts, behind policy, behind political activity? This brilliant insight of David's that political credo is the way to understand particularly history, leads us to a very deep insight to what's happening with Menzies and Downer. Both men believed liberty emerged from institutional continuity and that the EEC represented a departure from this inheritance. Now, unfortunately, Greg's gone, but I had the wonderful experience of having Greg Melleuish as my supervisor, and I learned so much from him about Britishness as a living institution, rooted in parliamentary institutions and responsible government. For Menzies and Downer, British identity was a constitutional inheritance, not sentimentality. It was loyalty to Britain, grounded in political civilization, not romantic memory. So in the correspondence, this is rather than Menzies being seen as a pragmatic realist, he said, quote, "I've been seeing the Commonwealth go to pieces for years now." He had become completely disillusioned. But I argue that Downer tried to protect this in his writings, his papers, his books, out of kindness. He didn't want Menzies to be seen as someone who was growing cynical of Britain, but in fact he had become that way. He saw Britain's EEC bid as a civilisational retreat. Pragmatic in strategy, traditionalist in political civilisation. Downer's perspective was he's an outspoken critical of the double talk, because Wilson, he spent a lot of time with Wilson. If you read a lot about Alick Downer, and I've done it, you see he spends years talking to Wilson. And Wilson said, "We will not be going into EEC." He gave him the assurance. And then he turned around and did the opposite. Even though he'd made the decision, that was the direction that he was going in. So he saw Britain's actions as personal and he felt betrayed. So their relationship, as I said, was forged on, I think, a number of trips that whenever he went to England, he stayed with Downer and he became very close and they developed a united view on this. So when they turned to Europe, the EEC membership, this contradicted the Westminster tradition in their view. It seemed like rupture, not adjustment. It seemed as if what was occurring was intolerable. And yet, as David Lee has pointed out, Menzies had already confronted limits of British strategic power. He'd reoriented defence towards the USA long before, in the 1960s. Yet emotionally and constitutionally tied himself to Britain, but he was realistic enough to turn towards America. So Menzies was a pragmatist, he was a realist, and yet he never lost his undying commitment to the British Empire. Immigration tensions, we've talked about the Commonwealth immigrants reclassified as foreigners and the humiliation of Australians with shared history. So to conclude, 3 shared themes: Commonwealth as moral community, commitment to constitutional inheritance, and Britain's EEC turn as historical rupture. These are the areas, this is the framework that these men were living within that have now been dismantled by England's activities or Britain's activities. Downer guarded Menzies, protected him in his writings, and even till Menzies' death in 1978, and I think Alick Downer died in about 1981, he continued to protect him whenever he wrote. So, to conclude, what was the ending? East of Suez withdrawal, imperial preference collapse, migration status reclassification. This is the twilight of the British world system. The British world system is going to pieces, as Menzies said, in front of their faces, in front of their eyes. 2 main leaders, post-World War Anglophiles, 2 leading Anglophiles, Menzies and Downer. Everything is changing for them. So to conclude, there's a binary collapse. Both men share the same worldview. It's not Menzies being realistic and Downer being the angry Anglophile. In fact, they were both sons of empire, witnessing its twilight. As Zach has said, Menzies has been observed as the last great British Prime Minister. The last great British Prime Minister. Final thoughts. Understanding their response deepens an understanding of post-war Australia. It reveals emotional and intellectual foundations of political identity. They stood together at the end of a world that had made them. Thank you very much.
This section of the conference is about sunsets, and I would like to talk about a reflection of the sunset. And this is a reflection in a letter, a single letter. It's a letter from the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to Robert Menzies. It's a letter that Menzies described as long and personal, and what his biographer Alan Martin described as remarkable. It's 18 pages long, 3,000 words, about as long as a conference talk today might be. Some background first. So by the end of 1961, Robert Menzies is miserable. On the 9th of December, he survived a nail-biting general election, having his majority reduced to 2 and then to 1 after the Speaker's chair was filled. How long his government would last, he couldn't say. "I'm presenting an agreeable face to the world," he told his daughter Heather. But down inside, he was worried. "I confess to you that I am singularly depressed." Menzies was locked in a precarious domestic situation and felt restrained from focusing too much on what was happening overseas. But it was hard not to. On the 31st of July 1961, Macmillan informed the House of Commons of Britain's intention to apply for membership to the European Economic Community. Macmillan hoped to uphold the British world system he had inherited in 1957. But by 1961, he was forced to confront a number of hard truths. Britain had the prestige of a world power, but none of the assets to go with it. And rapid decolonisation also meant the old Commonwealth had to accommodate more numerous, diverse and outspoken members. And Britain's own relative stagnation contrasted sharply with the remarkable rise of Western Europe, which was converging rapidly in GDP per capita with the United States. Now, America constituted the third of what Churchill had called the three circles, and it was Macmillan's role to identify Britain's place in these circles. He wanted to reassert Britain as a new national power, what he called a grand design, a buffer, he believed, in the Cold War between East and West, the bridge between America, Europe, and its own Commonwealth. But to do that, Britain had to stake its economic and political future in Europe. Menzies viewed this pivot as a political watershed and the outcome of what he would call the steady disappearance of the Commonwealth and some of the things it stood for. He understood that something once considered vital to Australia's destiny and constitutive of its identity was coming to an end. Macmillan understood Menzies' loyalty to and status amongst the old Commonwealth. He wanted and needed Menzies' support, both in easing public concerns and in calming internal angst amongst British Conservatives. In January 1962, he received a crestfallen letter from Menzies. The Australian Prime Minister was anxious about the state of the Commonwealth and the disappearance of so many of its old characteristics, as he said. "Some of the new members," Menzies said, "are strangers to our notions of self-government and civilised administration." Menzies did not deny the benefits of a European common market, but there is a great uneasiness in my own country, he said, which may lead to some weakening of our historic and invaluable ties. Macmillan was unnerved by Menzies' letter. He knew the Australian Prime Minister was increasingly disillusioned by events. His advisers suggested he write a really personal letter back. Macmillan liked Menzies, and they had developed a good relationship during the Suez Crisis. Menzies in turn respected Macmillan and enjoyed his company. As much as it was possible for two politicians to be, they were friends. They had in common the same approximate age, both born in 1894. They were the last prime ministers of their respective countries to be born during the reign of Queen Victoria, the last year to have William Gladstone as Prime Minister. This is what Churchill would call the British Antonine Age. This fact, I think, loomed over their identity. Macmillan in particular was a keen student of history. Barely a crisis passed him without a historical analogy being deployed. At the height of the Suez Crisis, he told Anthony Eden that Britain must not be like Louis XVIII returning in 1815 to a dull restoration, but rather like Napoleon breaking through the Alps towards the unification of Italy. Of the American relationship, he would say that Britain would act as Greeks in America's Roman Empire. Macmillan's famous phrases, "wind of change," "never had it so good," are themselves signposts of history, are taking stock of where things have been and where they might be going. Macmillan's long letter to Menzies is true to form. He wrote it to persuade a friend, to speak to Menzies' insecurities over the Commonwealth's future. It's all the more interesting because the common market is an economic arrangement. It's in the title, European Economic Community. But there's no economics in this letter. No word about markets or exports or imports. This is pure politics. Now, political leaders often, or at least used to, evoke storytelling and historical myth to persuade. But what's interesting to me is that these are two leaders corresponding with each other privately in these terms, where the main currency of their dialogue is history. The letter begins intimately. I know you will let me ramble on a little, Macmillan writes, as if we were talking in the same room. A few asides are thrown about the difficulty of modern governance. Then the substance of the letter emerges. You and I were born into a very different world, Macmillan writes, which seems, as now one recalls it, almost as long ago as the age of George III or Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria, the Jubilee, universal pride and confidence in the successful transformation of territories won haphazardly. Macmillan describes the old empire as they knew it, its two great divisions of India and the settler colonies, the colonial empire spread over Asia and Africa, the Pacific and the Far East. And now here we are, my dear Bob, two old gentlemen, prime ministers of our respective countries, 60 years later, rubbing our eyes and wondering what has happened. What really has happened is this. And here begins Macmillan's grand narrative of the 20th century. He could have titled it The Fall of European Man, because this is a very Eurocentric account. The two world wars, Macmillan argues, for all their destructiveness, at their heart did something much more significant. They destroyed the prestige of the Europeans. This was an epochal moment, the marking of the end of 2,000 years of Europeans broadly governing the world in a more or less coherent unit. Whether consciously or not, Macmillan sheds the word European for white people. It was bad enough for the white men to fight each other, but it was worse when they brought in their dependents. And what we have really seen since the war is the revolt of the yellows and blacks from the automatic leadership and control of the whites. It is this loss of moral authority that underwrites the rapid decolonisation taking place. The effect of all of this was to change the shape and character of the Commonwealth, he argues. India became an independent republic, and this set the pattern for the other countries to follow. This process, Macmillan argues, once begun, cannot be arrested. Of course, we could say that one of these small countries becoming independent should not be elected to the Commonwealth, but then where is it to go, Macmillan asks. His great fear was that it would go to communism. Macmillan comes to the issue that he says really dominates everything, the Cold War. The ideological struggle between the communists and the free world has elevated the importance of the non-aligned countries in a way that puts a tremendous blackmailing weapon into the hands of a good few of them. But the cost of putting up with the new Commonwealth is worth it while the communist free world division persists. In Europe, Macmillan worries about the reliability of France and Germany. And for this reason, he says, apart from any economic question, that I've slowly come to the conclusion that we ought, and indeed we must, try to have a political influence in Europe. Given all of this, he says, what are we to do about the Commonwealth? Of course, it is not the same. How can it be, he writes? They who all felt that they belonged to the same intimate family might quarrel, as families do, but they were family. Now it is becoming a sort of miniature United Nations with various groups, the Afro-Asian strength slowly organised, and the older members not knowing quite how to handle it. Macmillan doesn't believe there is any appetite for the old Commonwealth to exclusively regroup. Canada wouldn't agree, he says. The younger British Conservatives would neither, to say nothing of the opposition. Perhaps it comes down to the informal interactions, he says. the special basis of the relationships between the old Commonwealth members. But ultimately, it is the Cold War that must dictate the shape of the Commonwealth and force the old members to press on, to influence the newer members, slowly, gradually, but effectively. This is the crux of the letter. Alan Martin wrote of it that it reflects both Macmillan's affectionate concern for Menzies, difficulty in adjusting to change, and in his own adaptability. And the historian Stuart Ward, who has written extensively on Australian post-war identity and foreign policy, views the letter as a highly strategic tool, an exercise in empathy, drawing Menzies into the warm circle of family understanding before very gently stripping away all hope of a revived British community. For Macmillan, Ward argues, the rationale of the Commonwealth was no longer a question of amiable tea parties. And this, I think, represents the typical view of Menzies as old-fashioned and out of touch. For his part, Menzies sat on this letter for 2 months. We know very little about his immediate reaction. We know that he read the letter on the 12th of February, which he mentions in a letter to his daughter Heather. And although he calls it a long and personal letter, the only matter of substance he raises is the date at which he might meet with Macmillan in London. Eventually, he replies on the 18th of April. His response is not insubstantial, but it is in essence a reiteration of his concerns, all previously expressed. He worries about the viability of the Commonwealth. He's concerned about the political implications of Britain's possible integration with Europe, and he's trying to find a way to continue close ties with the old Commonwealth members. People like me are too deeply royalist at heart to live comfortably in a nest of republics, he writes in this letter, in an oft-quoted remark. In other words, as a strategic move, Macmillan's long and personal letter doesn't appear to move the needle. But I'd like to offer another reading of the letter, because I'm interested in the central role of historical narrative in it. It gives it the feel of a valediction, and not just to the old Commonwealth, but to something bigger, the ideal of Greater Britain, the old dream of a transcontinental political community made up of the mother country and its old self-governing settler colonies, bound by ethnicity, language, culture, and institutions, for whom integration in some form, constitutionally or informally, would preserve British strength and accelerate the progress of a world system stabilised and governed under British values and liberal principles as they were understood at the time. We talk often of Gallipoli as Australia's founding myth, but I think Menzies understood, as many of his generation did, that Greater Britain was the grander founding myth of the Australian Commonwealth. This is not a national story, but a liberal imperial story. The project of Greater Britain offered a way of imagining the new Commonwealth as a part of a wider political community and providing a program for Australian democracy. Greater Britain underwrote ideas about self-government, the rule of law, and the duties of citizens in a democracy. This was a historically specific project that dominated discourse, especially Australian liberal discourse, in the late 19th and early 20th century, and which took on different but familiar forms after the First World War. We've talked a lot about British race patriotism, but I think this is a subset of British race patriotism, and I think Menzies was the last Australian Prime Minister to hold on to the ideal of a Greater Britain. Interestingly, I think the valedictory character of Macmillan's letter lends it a fatalism that I don't think Menzies would have liked. And here I'd like to speculate, because I think Menzies would have found it a weak letter. Regarding the Commonwealth, Macmillan proposes only to muddle on. He describes the global scene in such a way that Britain appears almost a prisoner to circumstance. Maybe it was. There's something about the managerial strategist in tone, little about values, though drenched in a racialised language that, aside from all the moral problems with it, I actually think, interestingly enough, is mistargeted. The letter is full of generalisations, and they lend the analysis a rigidity that I think is unwarranted. The racialism in the letter deserves some attention because it's so central. Macmillan's story of the 20th century is about the end of a long white hegemony, shattered by European self-harm and followed by a messy, resentful revolt of what he would describe as formerly subordinate races into which communism has opportunistically asserted itself. But his generalities do not end there. He writes that the Germans are limited by a streak of barbarism. The Russian problem is that they believe themselves to be Asiatics and not Europeans. This is what he writes. I can't say whether he believed this sincerely or if he thought such a narrative might appeal to Menzies. But the primacy given to racial categories, I think, has the effect of making all subsequent choices in the letter seem more structurally limited. The problems of Europe and the Commonwealth become something to be managed rather than reshaped. And even to speak of Europe as a bloc yields some poor predictions. Macmillan writes that it would be almost impossible for us to continue in NATO or keep large forces at enormous expense to defend a Europe that does not want us economically or politically on reasonable terms. This proved to be incorrect. Again, to speculate, I think Menzies would have found these generalisations reductive and unconvincing. I think he would have liked to have seen Britain take a stronger stand on what shape the Commonwealth would take, not weighed down by what he would see as historical hang-ups, but rather articulating and defending a set of norms. There's an unpublished manuscript in Menzies' personal papers in the National Library, written in 1948, just as India is about to become an independent republic, where he calls for a spiritual rejuvenation of colonial unity. But it's a civic unity, founded on civic ideas and symbolised by the Crown. In Afternoon Light, Menzies ponders whether the idea of the rule of law might be the uniting element in the new Commonwealth where the Crown is no longer shared. I raise this because it goes to the tension within Greater Britain that Australian Liberals had long reckoned with, particularly post-war, but struggled to resolve. Macmillan emphasises the ethnological unity underpinning it. Menzies understood this, but never spoke about it in those terms. I don't want to overstate his progressive liberalism, but I think you can see in much of his writings and speeches an attempt to find a universal civic foundation for the Commonwealth, to treat it as an instrument rather than an identity. There was always a method to his sentimentality. He conceptualised the old Commonwealth in decidedly Burkean language, an organic political project, gradually evolving by experience and practice, a family of nations for whom an internal commitment to political freedom under the rule of law translated to a united voice for human liberty. And set against this gradualism was the utopian, what he would call the mechanical paper scheme of the United Nations, an organisation he respected, but of which he was abidingly sceptical. If he succeeded in his own mind to define the contours of the new Commonwealth in decidedly non-racial terms, the newer Commonwealth members were not convinced. Menzies' appeals to national sovereignty had a clear strategic and universal logic to them. But such appeals were often exercised in the name of protecting Australia from international criticism, even interference of its own racial record. I think the difference in how Macmillan framed the world in 1962 and how Menzies thought of it speaks to a much larger tension between liberalism and identity, whether they can be separated from each other or are innately connected. I think this is a tension that Paul Hasluck also found with his experience in Indigenous affairs. Was it British race patriotism that died in Australia in the 1960s, as some have suggested? Or did one Liberal project replace another, the rise of a more assertive Liberal internationalism against the kind of gradualism that Menzies preferred, underpinned by a system of sovereign nations joined by alliances and grounded in shared values and interests? In 2025, Britain has left Europe. AUKUS has arisen as central to Australia's defence interests. This tension shows no signs of abating. But far from being a sentimentalist only, I think Menzies was attempting to chart a pathway that many of us are searching for today. Thank you.
So the title of my talk is Menzies and Diefenbaker, Navigating the Post-British World. And what these two prime ministers have in common is that they both overlapped in their times in office in the late 50s and early 60s, as the Commonwealth was going through a very complex and tumultuous time. Menzies obviously had a very long and successful career as a head of government, and Diefenbaker did not. He had a short, tumultuous period in that role. But they both had to address the question of South Africa and the changing nature of the Commonwealth in that time when they overlapped. So, as I'm sure many of us know, in 1960, South Africa voted to become a republic, fulfilling a long-held goal of Afrikaner nationalism. The South African Prime Minister at the time, Hendrik Verwoerd, applied for South Africa to remain a member of the Commonwealth in 1961, as per the procedure established by India in 1949, something that, Menzies lamented very much at that time. However, he supported South Africa's ongoing membership at the 1961 Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference. And he was supported in that stance by all bar one of the old Commonwealth, or perhaps the white Commonwealth Prime Ministers. And that exception was Canada's progressive Conservative Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker. Menzies and Diefenbaker were both Conservative politicians with a deep and sincere commitment to their country's respective British traditions. However, they took different positions on a fundamental issue about the future of the British family of nations. And my goal today is, within the limited time that we have, to explain why that was the case. Their different stances reveal a great deal about their two characters and backgrounds, but they also tell us a little bit about the subtle differences between Australia and Canada, despite their overarching similarities as settler colonial societies that had emerged as independent states while keeping connections to the British Crown. So I'll begin by discussing the context and course of the 61 Commonwealth Conference. Second, I'll explain why I've come to think that Diefenbaker adopted his unique stance, and then I'll outline Menzies' position as well. As we can see here, this is the picture of the first Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference attended by both Menzies and Diefenbaker. It's obviously his first one after being elected in 1957, but Menzies is already a veteran of those meetings. And as we can see in this image, the Commonwealth's nature has changed significantly within the decade that Menzies was Prime Minister. And as one of the original dominions recognised by the Statute of Westminster, South Africa had an important role within the Commonwealth. However, unlike the other original dominions, Australia, Canada and New Zealand, the majority of its population was non-European. Like Canada, its white population was made up of two distinct groups, with one hostile to the British. But unlike Canada, whose French-Canadian population was a minority, the hostile population formed a majority of the South African white population. Just as the process of decolonisation began, South Africa's white-only electorate voted in a government committed to apartheid. So as the rest of the world was moving, however slowly or in whatever limited way, towards racial equality, the Commonwealth had to deal with a South Africa that was headed, in fact, in the opposite direction. Verwoerd and his foreign minister came to London in March 1961 to seek readmission to the Commonwealth, but they were by no means willing to compromise on the racial system of their government. Following the Indian precedent, South Africa announced its intention, its Prime Minister and Foreign Minister announced their intention that South Africa would declare itself a republic based on their whites-only referendum and rejoin the Commonwealth. However, unanimous consent would be needed, and by 1961, non-white members or post-colonial members of the Commonwealth already constituted a majority of the heads of government at that meeting. So that's the list of prime ministers and heads of government at the 1961 Commonwealth meeting. Those in yellow, plus Canada, which I'll get to at a moment, were critical of South Africa's position, and those in blue were favourable to its readmission. So Menzies, Macmillan, Holyoake of New Zealand, Walensky of Rhodesia all supported South Africa's ongoing inclusion in the Commonwealth grouping. They took the view that the reapplication should be approved as a constitutional question and that the Commonwealth should not intervene in the internal affairs of member states. And Menzies in particular saw autonomy as a key principle of the Commonwealth body. He fought to come up with a compromise that would be acceptable to all members of the Commonwealth and keep the body intact. Menzies believed, as he later explained in his report to the Australian Parliament, that there were no grounds for the refusal of South Africa due to the precedent established of the Commonwealth republics in the 1950s. John Diefenbaker originally supported South Africa's continued membership in 1960 at the previous conference. However, by 1961, he'd adopted the position of the new Commonwealth and wanted to forcefully declare the Commonwealth's commitment to racial equality as a principle. And in this stance, he continued the position of previous Liberal Canadian governments that had been in power for most of the preceding decades since the end of World War I, in that he seemed to be much more at ease in his relationships with the newly emerging countries of the Commonwealth like India, as opposed to Menzies in Australia, where the general consensus is that there was a discomfort with the new relationships. Diefenbaker explained that if we were to accept, and this was to the Canadian Parliament, if we were to accept South Africa's request unconditionally, our action would be taken as approval or at least condemnation of racial policies which are repugnant to and unequivocally abhorred and condemned by Canadians as a whole. He was the only white Commonwealth leader to side with the Asian African bloc. And in the end, Verwoerd was unable to accept the proposed wording of the statement on racial equality and individual rights, despite the efforts of Menzies and Macmillan to draft one that would be acceptable to South Africa. So why did Diefenbaker take this stance? So like, as was mentioned with Macmillan, he was born very close to the time of Menzies, being born in 1895 himself. He was born in Ontario just 1 year after Menzies had been born, and however, his father was the son of German immigrants. The family moved several times, but eventually ended up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a newly formed frontier province. He received his university education in Saskatoon and began a career as a prairie lawyer. He was attracted to the minority Tories in the province because he was opposed to the Canadian Liberals' support for free trade with the United States. He felt this would make Canada dependent on the US, and instead he had a deep commitment to Canada's relationship to Britain and the Empire. However, he was far from a British chauvinist, in that the newly emerging province where he grew up and had his early political career, he witnessed discrimination against Indigenous Canadians, French-speaking Canadians, various migrant groups, and those of mixed Indigenous and Canadian heritage. Interestingly, Eastern Europeans, in particular Ukrainians, were coming into the prairie provinces of Canada in very, very large numbers. So Canada was experiencing particularly Eastern European migration in very significant numbers much earlier than was the case in Australia. So the 1941 Canadian census reveals that approximately 14% of the province was Ukrainian, another 17% were German, and a majority altogether of the population was of various European ethnicities. Consequently, the province and the rest of Canada's western region did not fit neatly into the two nations framework, that idea that Canada is a compact between the French and the English. That framework lost relevance there. So while the population shared that it was largely European, the ideal of a multi-ethnic society impressed Diefenbaker greatly, and he expresses his deep commitment to non-discrimination and equality in his autobiography, One Canada. So while he was very committed to the British connection, the Crown and the Commonwealth, and in particular the old Canadian red ensign as the national flag, after he'd lost power, he very famously, filibuster is not the right word, but he tried to stop the Canadian Parliament from adopting what he thought was the horrible and meaningless maple leaf flag. He did deeply have a commitment to equal rights and non-discrimination within Canada itself as important political values. And when he came to power in 1957, he defeated a Liberal government that had been in power for more than 2 decades, but had established itself as something as a liberal moral force within world politics under the preceding Foreign Minister, Lester Pearson, who would later become Prime Minister. So as a leader in Canada, he made several significant milestones with regards to human rights and racial equality. His Progressive Conservative Party appointed the first Indigenous Canadian senator. Diefenbaker had done so because the dispersal of the Indigenous population meant that it was unlikely that there would ever be a riding that could reliably be expected to elect one. His government also took steps to give the vote to all Indians in Canada without taking away any of the rights that had been granted to them by various treaties with the Crown on the preceding centuries. So there are some similarities with Menzies there, who is also the person or the leader responsible for Indigenous voting rights in Australia. He in fact challenged the South African government and suggested to the South African Foreign Minister in in 1960, that the country would gain some goodwill if they at least appointed some members of racial minorities to the country's parliament, a suggestion that was very firmly rebuffed. Another key policy achievement of Diefenbaker was the Canadian Bill of Rights, and while it has since been superseded in historical and legal significance by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, it's something that was a milestone in Canada. He'd first advocated for a Bill of Rights in 1940 when the Liberal government had restricted civil liberties due to the declaration of World War II. Diefenbaker drew on his experience of discrimination in a multi-ethnic province, and when the Bill of Rights was put into effect in 1960 and explicitly stated that rights in Canada belong to all, regardless of race or national origin. Consequently, it's not surprising that having made these issues so important domestically, he felt compelled to bring these ideals to the Commonwealth Forum. In doing so, he continued the generally positive and comfortable disposition to the new post-colonial world that had epitomised the previous government in Ottawa. In contrast, the Menzies government can be characterised as being uncomfortable with the new waves in global politics, although that's certainly not universal across all members of that government. So despite their shared cultural conservatism, there's a divergence between the two at the 1961 conference. Canada under Diefenbaker was already conceiving of itself as a multi-ethnic society in a way that was not necessarily the case in Australia at that time. His human rights commitment meant that he came to view apartheid as necessitating an exception to the Commonwealth's usual commitment to non-interference with member states. If the Commonwealth was to survive, he said that it had to be colourblind. Now, looking at Menzies' positions, however, he definitely had very understandable and rational positions for why he took the opposing stance to Diefenbaker at the conference. So one of the reasons Menzies was opposed to the exclusion of South Africa was that he was he was critical of the emergence of much of the new Commonwealth countries and how they were treating the body. As we know, the British Empire at the time of his birth, in 1894, as he describes it, was a settled world and on the whole a good one. The Empire, of course, had experienced great change, but Menzies was deeply attached to the Commonwealth of the Balfour Formula, which had been built around the principle of autonomous dominions, not subordinate to one another, but united by common allegiance to the British Crown. Menzies had often defended these arrangements with some emotion. Menzies lamented the permission granted to India to rejoin the Commonwealth as a republic in 1949, or was critical of that process, because common allegiance to the Crown ceased to be the bond of unity, and the King merely became the head of the Commonwealth. And the phrase British Commonwealth slowly fell into disuse. In the lead up to the 1961 conference, Menzies lamented that, quote, "When we were all related by common allegiance, our relationship was organic and internal. It still is for the most part of the older members, but for most of the Republicans, the relationship is in a sense functional and certainly external," unquote. Rather than forming an organic whole, the body risked becoming a miniature United Nations. The pressure was increasingly on a growing number of leaders to go to the meetings and perform for their own domestic political audiences. A desire to interfere in the affairs of the other member states emerged. Menzies remained committed to the ideal of the Commonwealth that leaders refrain from such interference. In addition to this commitment to the old value of autonomy and non-interference, Menzies recognised a direct threat to Australia's position from the action taken towards South Africa. Responding to criticism of Arthur Calwell about his government's lack of strong response to the Sharpeville massacre, Menzies argued that if the domestic jurisdiction principle is abandoned in the heat of the moment, then the UN or another body might seek to interfere in Australia's domestic policies on Aborigines. Menzies also highlighted on his return to Australia after the conference that he believed that Australia's immigration policy, while fundamentally different from apartheid in that it dealt with discrimination against people not already resident in the country, was therefore quite different. Menzies felt that the international campaign against South Africa, which he described as taking on moral and religious feelings, was often perpetuated in Australia by those who also sought to end Australia's immigration policy. And thus, he said, my colleagues and I were not unconscious to the dangers to our immigration policy inherent in the proposition that a matter normally of domestic jurisdiction can become one of international jurisdiction if it excites criticism and hostilities in other lands. Consequently, Menzies' attitude at the 61 conference can be categorised as defensive of both the old ways of the Commonwealth, which he loved, but also out of a pragmatic desire to protect Australia from interference in its own sovereign choices on immigration. So just to conclude, Menzies and Diefenbaker represented very contrasting attitudes towards the Commonwealth by 1961. Menzies resisted interference in South Africa's internal affairs, fearing it would erode a character of the Commonwealth as a cooperative family and potentially threaten Australia's immigration policies. In contrast, Diefenbaker embraced the evolving Commonwealth as a force for anti-racism and prioritising moral principles over traditional non-interference. And in doing so, he was shaped by Canada's social context and his experience in the prairie provinces. And just out of interest, they're just things about the South African referendum. But just finally, this is from the Tribune, which is the Communist Party of Australia's newspaper. And this is Menzies returning from the 1961 conference, and inside his jacket the terms White Australia, Aborigines and Papua New Guinea. So the Australian communists felt that he had adopted his stance at the conference because he was trying to make sure that nobody ever intervened in Australia's policies in those areas. So I just thought that was an amusing cartoon of his return from the conference. But as I've said already, and many others have mentioned, Menzies' deep commitment to the Commonwealth as an institution and the British Empire was deeply felt and principled in many ways. So I'll just end it there. But thank you very much for listening to the presentation.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.